In the Soviet Union, now Russia, there were pioneer heroes for the upbringing of children and youth. People looked up to them and tried to imitate their lives and actions. The feats of these children are truly immortal, and their names unforgettable. But among them, there is one whom the modern generation hardly knows about. Streets were named after him, monuments were erected, books were written, and films were made about him. And then, in the late 1980s, he suddenly became an anti-hero, an informant who betrayed his own father, and people tried to forget his name. I am talking about PAVLIK Morozov. There is a classic version recorded in Soviet school textbooks. Pavlik reported his own father to the OGPU, the Special State Security Agency of the USSR, and his grandfather, old Sergei Morozov, could not forgive this and killed his grandson. So, does it turn out that Pavlik betrayed his own father and became a hero? How can that be? How can anyone take this as an example? From the very beginning, this story was very confusing and unclear. And even then, society's attitude toward Pavlik Morozov was ambiguous. Some admired him, others hated him, and others simply didn't understand why he acted that way. But then, and now, there are questions. Who was he? A young fighter for truth, or a victim of a monstrous ideology? A pioneer hero who dreamed of a bright future and was ready to do anything for it? Or a traitor who got what he deserved? Or maybe his story is a carefully planned propaganda campaign, and he was just a small cog in a big propaganda machine. Let's try to get a little closer to the truth, even though it will not be easy. Truth and fiction are too tightly intertwined in this story. But we will try to consider all versions. What plays an important role in raising a child? Of course, family with its moral principles and values. So what kind of family did Pavlik have? Why, in the only photograph preserved in the archives and later used as a model for illustrations and monuments, is he a sad and downtrodden boy? Let's go to Russia at the beginning of the last century. The Stolypin agrarian reform was sweeping across the country, under which many peasants without land plots in densely populated areas were sent to the sparsely developed regions of Siberia and the Urals. There they received land allotments and some state support. Thus, in the village of Gerasimovka, Tobolsk province, the Morozov family appeared in 1910. It should be said that the order in this family was very strict. The head of the family, Sergei Morozov, Pavlik's grandfather, was a strict and authoritarian man. In Tsarist Russia, he was a gendarme, a prison overseer. There he met his future wife, Aksenia, who had served time for horse theft. By the way, the woman was known for her cruelty and tendency toward crime. Only thanks to a bribe her future husband slipped into the right hands did Aksenia avoid a second sentence for theft. Sergei Morozov was no gentle soul either. He believed the world was held together only by force, and it's no wonder that very soon the small village of Gerasimovka was under his influence. The Morozovs raised their children strictly too. For the slightest offense, they tied them to a bench and beat them with rods. Is it any surprise that Trofim, Pavlik's father, who grew up in such a family, was also quite harsh? During the Civil War, Trofim Morozov was a commander in the Red Army, so upon returning to Gerasimovka, he immediately became chairman of the village council. Maybe no one else wanted the job, but most likely, no one dared to oppose the Morozovs, who by then firmly held power in Gerasimovka. Soon, Trofim married a beautiful girl, Tatiana Baidakova. Did the girl love Trofim so much that she agreed to marry him despite his cruelty, or was she also intimidated? Tatiana was from a neighboring village and knew nothing about the authoritarian Morozovs. She really married for love. Soon, in November 1918, Tatiana and Trofim's first child was born, Pavel. There were 4 boys in total. The 5th child died as an infant. Rumors said Trofim himself was to blame for this, and the husband's family didn't like their daughter-in-law. She was beautiful, smart, and had a strong character. Tatiana was immediately against living in the same house with her husband's parents and running the household together. This simply drove Sergei and Aksiniya crazy, who tried every time to remind their daughter-in-law that she was nobody in their house. Sometimes the father-in-law, Trofim's father, even beat Tatiana and her little children, his grandchildren. Tatiana couldn't stand it and one day convinced her husband to move to their own home. This angered Trofim's mother. How could this girl break their Morozov family's centuries-old way of life? Sergei Morozov himself was calm about it at first. They want to live separately, let them live. They will come running back. Later, because of this weakness, he hated Tatiana and all her children even more. Otherwise, he never called them anything but puppies. Here's your grandmother and grandfather. Never hugged their grandchildren, never felt sorry for them, and gifts, which grandparents love to spoil grandchildren with, don't even mention it. Aksiniya and Sergei didn't consider Tatiana's children their own. That's how strong their hatred was toward the proud daughter-in-law. And most likely, the roots of this tragic story must be sought right here. But who else to love, if not grandchildren? The old Morozovs had someone to give affection and warmth to, a grandson named Danilka, only 5 years older than Pavlik. He was considered the master and heir of the family business. Tatiana's children were seen only as hired workers, laborers. By the way, the appearance of this grandson, Danilka, in the Morozov family is shrouded in mystery. There are different versions about his origin. According to one, he was a late son of Sergei and Aksiniya themselves, but they were already nearly 80 years old then. A very doubtful version. According to another, the boy's father was the eldest son of the Morozovs. His wife, Danila's mother, died, and he returned to his parental home with the baby. But there is also another, quite plausible version. The Morozovs also had a daughter who gave birth to a child out of wedlock. Danila didn't even have a patronymic, although maybe he was just too young to be called by first name and patronymic. Why the prodigal daughter was kept in the family and not kicked out is unknown, but the child was given their last name. And they loved this boy more than all the others. Why, also unclear. But this will play an important role in the whole story. And Pavlik grew up in a different family and loved his mother and younger brothers very much. In those years, poverty reigned in the villages. Gerasimovka was no exception. There was no electricity. People sat in darkness or burned splints, thin, long strips of dry wood that barely lit the huts. Kerosene was saved, and not everyone had it. Children went to school only while it was warm. In winter, they stayed home, warming themselves in the ash, and many of them didn't even have shoes. But many wanted to study, so Pavlik's mother sent him to school at age 12. Scandals flared up in the family again. Both grandfather and father did not let him attend classes. They needed a strong worker in the household, not an educated boy who might leave the village. But Tatiana went against the family's will again, insisting on her own. By the way, information about Pavlik's schooling is very contradictory. Some said he gladly went to school where he really liked reading and writing. Pavlik even borrowed books from the teacher to read himself and to teach his mother literacy, but he had little time for this. He had to work in the fields and help with household chores. So the boy often missed lessons and then tried to catch up. Others said Pavlik didn't like studying at all and hated reading. He could not learn all the letters for a long time and then barely read by syllables, and he was the dirtiest and most quarrelsome in the class. There were even rumors he played cards for money. So it's hard to imagine that Pavlik at age 13 was a very educated person who knew the tasks of the Bolshevik Party. But we will definitely return to this episode. What do we know about Trofim Pavlik's father? He never became a good father or a family man. He loved to drink and also beat his wife, Tatiana. The boys got it too, especially the oldest. Soon, Trofim had a mistress, a cheerful neighbor from the same village. At first, he only stayed overnight there, but then he left the family altogether, leaving his wife with the little children. But he didn't stop coming to their house. As soon as he drank well, he would definitely drop by his ex-wife. It's clear that such visits were little like a pleasant tea party. Trofim almost immediately flew at his wife and children with fists. Pavlik tried to calm his furious father, shielding his mother and brothers, but what could he do against a grown man? Sometimes neighbors ran over to the screams. Then Trofim left, but did not calm down. Now all the household chores were done by Pavlik. He was the oldest man in the family and considered himself the main one responsible for his mother and brothers. We didn't spend so much time on this family conflict for nothing. Without this, it will be difficult to understand what happened later. So, Trofim Morozov, chairman of the village council, illiterate but authoritative. But this authority was based on fear and force. Trofim had a very bad character. The villagers couldn't name any positive traits. One big plus, the man served as a commander in the Red Army. Little is known about his combat achievements, but having gained power in the village, he started behaving like a tyrant. He was the military leader here, the authority, and almost God himself. Special settlers, dissatisfied with Soviet power, Kulak peasants from Kuban and Ukraine, took advantage of this. They needed certificates to avoid travel restrictions. Trofim issued them for a good reward. In Gerasimovka, this was no secret. Many Russian rural areas did the same then. But Chairman Morozov didn't stop there. He began appropriating confiscated property from wealthy peasants and sometimes hid kulaks from taxes for bribes. At that time, Soviet authorities considered the district where the Morozovs lived one of the most dangerous. The locals did not want to join collective farms. There was not a single kolkhoz in Gerasimovka, and there were many wealthy families. The OGPU took up the case. In 1930, the state security workers became very interested in the large number of certificates issued to Gerasimovka residents. An investigation began, and very soon the village council chairman Trofim Morozov was under suspicion. For forgery and selling documents, he faced up to 10 years in prison. Here begins the most confusing moment of the whole story. According to the Soviet legend, pioneer PAVLIK Morozov actively supported all Soviet reforms, including collectivization, the formation of kolkhozes. The boy opposed wealthy kulaks, which included his grandfather and uncles, and when he learned his father helped them, he reported this to the appropriate authorities. The boy also supposedly reported that a neighbor was hiding grain, and his own aunt and her husband were stealing grain from the state. Part of the stolen harvest was at his grandfather's. The young hero told everything about the property hidden from confiscation and participated in actions searching for the hidden goods together with Soviet authorities. That is, this boy was an example to everyone of how public duty should be placed far above personal interests. A beautiful story, or the opposite? But what really happened? According to archival documents, when a criminal case was opened against Trofim Morozov, his wife Tatiana realized she could finally get rid of her sadistic husband by locking him up for a long time. She agreed to testify against Trofim. By that time, the investigation already had a lot of evidence of his guilt, and there was no denunciation from Pavlik. The boy simply testified in court as a witness. He decided to support his mother, who gave the main testimony against her husband. The child naively hoped that his father would come to his senses, return to the family, and their life would get better. It should be noted that at that time, Pavlik was still a minor, and his testimony was not seriously considered. The court documents contain just one sentence. At the trial, son Pavel described all the details about his father, his misdeeds. Several versions of Pavlik Morozov's accusatory speech are fabrications by journalists and writers made much later. By the way, modern historians also confirm the version that the son did not denounce his father. The fact is that Trofim Morozov had many enemies in the village who really wanted to remove him from the chairman's post, and it was on their instigation that the investigation of all his schemes began. Anyway, Trofim Morozov was convicted and sent to a labor camp for 10 years. Tatiana was happy, but meanwhile, trouble was already knocking at her door. If only the woman had known how it would end, she wouldn't have gone to court herself, nor would she have let Pavlik go there. But unfortunately, we cannot yet look into the future and do not know what awaits us around the corner. So Trofim served his sentence, and financial difficulties began in the family of Sergei and Aksiniya Morozov. They immediately decided who was to blame: the hated daughter-in-law and her little son, who had turned against their own people. Black hatred clouded their minds. They wanted revenge. But how to strike the hardest? At first they decided to kill Tatiana, but then changed their minds. No, that was too easy a punishment for her. And what if they also had to watch over the children? What if... A devilish plan immediately took shape. They began to manipulate their grandson Danilka, and he did not resist. He couldn't stand his brothers. And so, the time for revenge came. In early September 1932, Tatiana went to the city to sell a calf. Pavlik and his younger brother Fedya decided to make a gift for their mother, to pick berries in the forest. Taking baskets, they walked past their grandfather's windows to the forest edge, straight into their doom. Why were the boys killed? Who confessed to this crime? And how is it viewed in the modern world? Tatiana returned home in the evening and found that her two sons were missing. A mother's heart ached with a premonition of the worst, and she rushed to search for them all over the village. But the villagers just shrugged. No one had seen the boys. On the fifth day, Tatiana insisted that the local police take up the search. Then a search party was organized, which found two small, lifeless bodies, Pavlik and Fedya, at the forest edge. The grandfather's house was immediately searched, and the murder weapon was found: a knife with bloodstains and Danila Morozov's blood-stained clothes. During the investigation, it was revealed that Danila and two of Pavlik's uncles, Arseny Kulukhanov and Arseny Stalin, together with grandfather Sergei and grandmother Aksiniya, tracked the boys in the forest. Grandfather and Arseny Kulukhanov held Pavlik and Fedya, and Danila did the killing. For the murder, Danila Morozov and Arseny Kulukhanov, who constantly provoked Danila, were sentenced to execution. Grandfather and grandmother were sent to prison, from which they would never come out. Their age had caught up with them. Only one was acquitted, Arseny Stalin. For some reason, the court did not find his actions criminal. Strange, isn't it? He stood nearby, watched, didn't kill, but he didn't stop it either. The murder of the children did not shock the residents of Gerasimovka. Many had already grown used to the cruelty of the elder Morozovs. But outside the village, this tragedy caused a wide public outcry. The trial of the accused attracted great attention, and the boys were presented as victims of cruel kulak revenge, who died for their loyalty to Soviet power. On November 14, 1932, Pavlik Morozov would have turned 14, and 5 days later an article about his death appeared in one of the Ural newspapers. From that moment, an ordinary village boy was elevated to the status of pioneer hero. And the younger brother, Fedya, who also died at the hands of relatives, was almost forgotten. Becoming a hero after death was helped by literary invention and talent. Provincial writer and journalist Pavel Solomin wrote the book In the Kulak's Nest, which told of the feat of an ordinary boy from the Ural backwoods. In 1933, this book fell into the hands of the famous writer Maxim Gorky, the founder of the new literary direction, social realism. Gorky clearly understood that Pavlik's story was exactly what society needed at the time. The image of a pioneer hero who died for the ideals of communism could be actively used to educate youth in the spirit of loyalty to the party. But interestingly, Gorky himself, for some reason, did not approve the book and suggested revisions. Most likely the writer was afraid of someone else's success in this direction, or maybe he himself wanted to write something similar but was beaten to it. Only the story of the #1 Soviet pioneer hero did not leave Maxim Gorky indifferent, and he began organizing funds for a monument to Pavlik Morozov in Moscow. By the way, well-known writers at the time, Arkady Gaidar and Alexander Twardowski were going to write about this boy too. But for some reason, they suddenly changed their minds. What stopped them? Inconsistencies in the case materials and lack of heroic deeds, or a feeling of hypocrisy and forgery? We can only guess. Interesting fact. Let's open any story, book, or play where the main character is Pavlik Morozov. There, it is vividly described how the pioneer hero composes party slogans, agitates the local peasants, telling them about the construction of socialism. This somehow doesn't fit at all with the image of an illiterate boy, and even causes a crooked smile. In 1936, a film called Bezhin Meadow was made based on the story of Pavlik Morozov. But Soviet censorship did not release this film to theaters. The image of the main character, Stepka, caused too ambiguous reaction. They suggested remaking the film, leaving the pioneer fighting for collectivization alive. But this version also failed the review, and the film was banned. The only copy was sent to the Capitol's archive, which burned down in 1941 during bombing. And yet, the film Pavlik Morozov, made by other people, was released, but only in 1957. After the collapse of the USSR, it was gradually forgotten, and the monument in Moscow also turned out to be not so simple. In many other cities, monuments already stood. There, a bronze or plaster pioneer either stood deep in thought or walked with wide steps, but his gaze was always directed toward the bright future. They wanted to put a bronze Pavlik near the Alexandrovsky Garden at the entrance to Red Square. Sketches were ready, the project was approved. Even Maxim Gorky himself promised Pavlik's mother that her son's name would always be remembered by people. But something went wrong here too, and the monument was forgotten. Soon after, the Great Patriotic War began, and new pioneer heroes appeared. Another nuance. Pavlik is called a pioneer, but he never was one, and he probably didn't even know who they were. The pioneer squad was very quickly organized in Gerasimovka a month after the boys died. The myth of the pioneer hero needed a basis. Now it's time to review the investigation once more. In official documents, the boys were killed out of revenge, but debates about the true motives of the crime continue even today. Let's consider several versions. The first. The murder of the boys was indeed an act of retribution, but not for betraying their father. The reason was painfully banal. The land issue. The fact is, when Trofim married, his father gave him a good plot of land. After Trofim left for another family, half of this plot legally belonged to Tatiana. This was a terrible blow for the Morozovs, especially for the grandfather, Sergei. By the way, Trofim caused scandals demanding his land back, but raising 4 boys without a farm in the village was simply impossible. When Trofim was imprisoned, the second half of the plot went to the eldest son, Pavlik, and the grandfather wanted his land back, so he got rid of Trofim's 2 eldest sons. This version, along with the official one, lasted until the late 1980s, until the book Informer 001 by writer Yuri Druzhnikov was published amid the wave of general criticism of Soviet power. It was published in London, despite glasnost and perestroika declared in the Soviet Union. The book was banned there. And another version of what happened appeared. Trying to investigate the case, Druzhnikov studied archival documents and discovered that the first protocols on the boys' murder were dated September 4th. But by that time, the children's bodies had not yet been found. How could this happen? Thinking about this question and flipping through several more yellowed pages of that strange case, the writer concluded that the deaths of Pavlik and Fedya were nothing but a provocation by the OGPU. At that time, they really needed a loud crime to blame the kulaks and launch a war against them. After all, as a result, the most active organizers of resistance to collectivization were removed from Gerasimovka. Another important aspect interested Druzhnikov. Neither the investigation, nor the court, nor the press asked the important question: why did the killer commit the crime so close to home and did not try to cover his tracks? Near the village were swamps where the boys' bodies could have easily been hidden, and then it could have been said that the boys fell victim to bears wandering the area. Why did no one find it strange that an experienced grandfather, a former gendarme, did not throw away Danila's knife and blood-stained clothes, and that the killer himself stayed at home, although he could easily have fled to the taiga or another village? By the way, the edition included photos the author took half a century after the events, and illustrations of unique archival photo documents personally collected by him. Then Pavlik was forgotten for a short time. He was remembered again in the early 1990s. Those were turbulent times for Russia when all spiritual values were suddenly being reconsidered. Then several TV channels broadcast a story about how the elderly residents of Gerasimovka gladly shamed the one they had until recently considered their hero. The poor Pavlik was not left in peace even here. Although, to be honest, thanks to his name, living conditions in Gerasimovka were better than in other villages of the same type. A good road was laid here, a school and a museum named after Pavlik Morozov were built, which provided local residents with jobs, by the way. As usual, we create heroes for ourselves, only to loudly debunk them later. There were even those who tried to prove that Pavlik Morozov was a completely made-up character, and there were no photos of him at all. All this was specially invented Soviet propaganda. Well, here we can confidently say, Pavlik Morozov really existed. The whole story of his short life is confirmed by eyewitness testimony and archival documents. As for the one single photo, well, what times were those? How could there be a photographer in a village? Jumping ahead, it must be said that interest in this case would fade and then flare up again. And so, in 2005, British researcher Catriona Kelly became interested in it. She, a professor at Oxford University, managed to access the archives of the current FSB to study the case materials. Then Catriona went to Gerasimovka to meet with local residents. The result of all her work was the well-known book Comrade Pavlik. This work describes well the actual trial of the organizers of the boys' murder. Catriona Kelly points out that the testimonies of the accused in court were very contradictory. At first, Danila confesses to the murder, then suddenly the grandfather, who was already 80 years old. And here the author suddenly suggests another motive for the murder. Danila fanatically hated his cousin Pavel and often fought with him. This hatred was constantly fueled by the grandfather, grandmother, and other relatives. What if, upon meeting Pavlik and Fedya in the forest, Danila, encouraged by his uncle Arseny, killed the teenagers, and then got scared and ran home to tell everything to his grandfather? The grandfather, who loved his Danilka, decided to take all the blame on himself, but didn't have time to hide the evidence. This crime can be considered in this way too. But still, there is too much fog in this story. Pavlik Morozov is not just a character from the past. He is a symbol of an era in which family and personal morality were sacrificed to state ideology. His story is a lesson about how far society can go if loyalty to an idea becomes more important than human life. It should be added that Stalin's rule was the heyday of informing, snitching. Especially actively in the 1930s, children took part in this. So-called young correspondents, tetkori, willingly wrote reports about their peers who skipped school, came late, or studied poorly. They didn't spare adults either. They complained about parents who supposedly failed to raise their children properly, and about teachers accused of negligence or wrong views. The habit of reporting to the authorities continued in the following decades. Citizens kept writing complaints and denunciations about neighbors, colleagues, and sometimes even their own relatives. Often this happened almost automatically by inertia. But Pavlik Morozov was neither a traitor nor an informant, nor was he a pioneer hero. He simply turned out to be a useful tool in the hands of the authorities. What happened to Pavlik's other relatives? his father Trofim, was sent to build the White Sea-Baltic Canal, where he received an order and early release for shock labor. The man returned to Gerasimovka and lived there, trying not to remind anyone of himself or his family's difficult history. Tatiana Morozova, understanding the threats from her former husband and his relatives, left Gerasimovka, receiving housing and benefits from the OGPU. After the war, she moved to Alupka, where she lived until her death in 1983. Neighbors spoke of her as a rude, cunning, and quite unfriendly person who shamelessly used all the privileges she got thanks to Pavlik's deed. She was often invited to pioneer and Komsomol events dedicated to his memory. But she never told the truth. There is also little information about the other brothers. One of them died at the front during the Great Patriotic War. The second, Alexei, was captured and considered a traitor. Later, he was rehabilitated, got married, and had 2 sons. Alexei never spoke about Pavlik Morozov being his brother. Only once, when his brother's name was being slandered, did the younger Morozov try to defend his honor. But time does not stand still. Monuments decay, and legends follow them into the past. That's what happened with the story of Pavlik Morozov. And was it even worth digging up events from almost 100 years ago? We were not just debunking a myth. We wanted to restore the truth, to appreciate truth, freedom, and personal responsibility even more. To show how easy it is to be on a pedestal under one government and just as easy to fall from it under another. And that is why the story of Pavlik Morozov continues to spark interest and debate to this day. Isn't that right?